So in this video, I want to go over a simulation on demand and supply and see how the principle of the invisible hand in microeconomics actually works in an ideal market. So the first thing we need to do is uh, build the basics for our demand supply model and build the basics for our market. So our market will be made of two kinds of people, producers and consumers. Producers will build products and sell them, and consumers will buy them. Uh, each producer and consumer will have their own maximum price at which they can afford to buy the product, and this will be based on, say, their income and all the other things they have to, all the other financial requirements they have in their lives. So for now, we can just randomly generate their maximum prices from 0 to 1, and if we sort them in ascending and descending order, we get the familiar demand and supply curves. So if we sort demand by descending order, you get the downward sloping demand curve, which essentially states that only when the price goes down will the market actually end up buying a higher quantity, which makes sense because now you can afford to buy more since the price is less. And supply works the other way, which is that you need a much higher price to be incentivized to produce a higher quantity. Now, these are just the limits for the producers and consumers, meaning that a consumer will never buy the product at a price which is higher than on this orange line, and a producer will never sell a product at a price which is below this blue line. So essentially, but apart from this, we also have our own prices in mind at which we are more of ready to buy, right? So even if we can afford to pay say $1 for a product, we may not be willing to pay more than 75 cents for the same product. So that will be determined by the expectation that you have. So let's add the expectation or your prices into the simulation. So now you can see here that I've added the expectation and the prices. So right now, or the prices. So right now these are again randomly generated, and you can see that for every orange dot represents one consumer, and every blue dot represents one producer. So you can see that the vertical axis is the price, and the horizontal axis doesn't have any significance. It's just individual dots. So you can actually see that all the dots are below the demand curve. For all the orange dots are below the demand curve, which basically states that all of them have their prices from 0 to whatever their limit is, and the blue dots are always above the supply curve, so their limit is always above what their minimum acceptable price is. So now let's define the rules for how trading will work in our market. So every day what will happen is we'll pair up two people, a consumer and a producer, and they both will compare their prices or their expectations, not their limits but their expectations. And if the consumer's price is higher than the producer's price, so like if say we paired up this dot and this dot, then they would make a trade, because the consumer is willing to pay a higher price than the producer wants. So they're perfectly fine in making a trade. And the price at which the trade is made will, for now, just be the average of the two prices. And now what happens is that this consumer goes home and reflects, and he says, okay, I got a deal pretty quickly because I just walked up to one random producer and I got a deal. That means that I must be paying too high a price, and I could probably get away buying the same product for a slightly lower price. So the next day when he comes to the market, his dot will actually shift down because he's sort of reduced his price. And the producer will do the exact opposite, right? So he goes home and says, okay, I just met with one random consumer today, and they were ready to buy at my price, which means that I'm probably selling it too cheap, so everyone's excited to buy it. Maybe if I increase the price a little bit, I'll still be able to sell it. So the blue dot will try to increase its price, and the next day when it comes, that same blue dot will be a bit higher. But now things get a bit more complicated when the blue dot is higher than the orange dot, meaning that the producer wants more than the consumer is willing to pay right now. Not ability, but willing. So then they do some bargaining. And if the blue dot, so like let's say if we pair up this blue dot and this orange dot right here, So you can see that this blue dot is still below the orange dot's ability, his limit. So they can still make a trade and be happy about it. So they'll probably do some bargaining and still end up making a trade. But now when they go home and reflect, the consumer will say, okay, I think I might be putting my willingness to buy at too low a price because producers are a bit hesitant to buy, producers are a bit hesitant to sell to me. And so that's why he'll try to increase his price. On the other hand, the producer will go back and say, okay, maybe I'm selling these products at too high a price, which is why consumers are still uh, consumers are a bit hesitant to buy from me. So he'll decrease his price by a little bit. Both of them will only change the price by a little bit in this scenario. Then there's a third scenario, which is that the price that the producer wants is just higher than how much the consumer can even pay. So for example, if we take this blue dot and we take this orange dot, we can see that this producer wants a price which is much higher than what this consumer can pay. So they can't make a trade. And so now for one trading day, for one day that the market is open, consumers and producers keep getting randomly paired until no more transactions can occur. And in that scenario, what happens is all the consumers that didn't get to buy a product, they will try and increase their price by a lot because they didn't even get, no producer was willing to sell it to them. But they will be limited by their demand curve because that's their ability, that's their limit. So they can't go above it. And the producers, they'll do the exact opposite. They weren't able to sell a product to anyone, so they'll decrease their price by a lot. But again, they'll be limited by the supply curve. So now if we just implement these rules and see what happens after we let these producers and consumers trade for, let's say 100, 200, 300 days and just see what actually happens. So here you can see that I've set up the simulation and once I press the start button, these producers and consumers will start trading. The below chart actually shows you the surplus. So the surplus is essentially the price that for consumers, it's the price that they got. If the price that they got is less than the price they were willing to pay, then it's their ability to pay, then it's a positive surplus, right? So if this consumer whose ability is 1 got a deal at say 0.5, then his surplus would be 0.5 because he got away with $0.5 of notional profit. And for producers, it'll be the exact opposite. This person was able to sell it at almost zero. This producer was able to sell it at almost zero. But if they got a deal at 0.5, then again, they would be making $0.5 of notional profit. So now, if we just add all the producers, the surplus of all the producers, you get the producer surplus. And for consumers, you get the consumer surplus. And if I add both of these bars, I get the market surplus. So now let's run the simulation and see what happens. So you can see that the dots are moving, which reflects how they're actually adjusting their prices. And if we just let it run for a little longer, we see that surprisingly, all of them have converged to the same spot. So there are actually two parts to this graph right now. One is on the right side of this intersection point between demand and supply curve. So on the right side, we see that all the producers have been limited to their supply curve. This person updated the price to be below, but the next market day, if they go back, at the beginning of the day, they'll change it back to their limit. So you can see that he went back up. So now the reason for this is that these producers just want too high a price. It's way more than 0.5. Like say this person wants almost 1 and this person wants almost around 0.75. So they find it having a very hard time getting a trade. So they just keep decreasing the prices until they reach their limit. And they get an occasional trade or two, but generally stay on the limit. And for the consumers, it's the exact opposite. They're willing to pay too low a price, like around 0.25. So they also find it hard to get a trade. And that's why they just keep increasing their prices, but are limited to their demand curve. So now the left half is more interesting. because you see that all of the dots have come and form a single straight line. And that means that even though everyone was greedy, everyone was acting in their own self-interested way, they all converge to the same price, which is 0.5. So they've reached market equilibrium. And this is exactly what the principle of the invisible hand states, which is that even when everyone acts in their own self-interested way, they all come to a socially optimum equilibrium. And how do we measure whether something is socially optimum or not? That's with the surplus. So right now you can see that the market surplus is quite a bit over 15. And if you just keep this number in mind, we'll see how that changes over the course of other intrusions. So now let's move on to how the government can come and interfere, and what microeconomics has to say about government intervention in a free market. So now let's start with the first basic government intervention, which is the implementation of a tax. So in our system, in our simulation, the tax will be very simplistic. What happens is that every time a producer makes a sale, they go to the government and they pay a fixed amount of tax, irrespective of the price of the product. And so now this slider up here controls what the value of the tax is. So now you'll actually notice that I've added this green line over here, which is just a slightly shifted version of the blue line. And the reason I've added this is now the limit or the maximum ability for the producer changes, because say initially they could take a minimum price of 0.25. Now they have to pay a tax of 0.1. So they actually need 0.35 so that they can go to the government and pay the 0.1 tax and then take home the 0.25 amount. But whereas before they could just directly take 0.25 and satisfy the requirement. So this green line, that's why this green line is a shifted version of the blue line, and it now represents the ability of the producers after the imposition of the tax. So now let's run the simulation again and see what happens. So now you'll notice that the producers and consumers have formed two separate lines. And that's actually because of the imposition of the tax. So the producers come at the new market equilibrium, which is the intersection between the new supply curve, which is the new abilities of the producers, which is the green line, and the demand curve. So the consumers are actually paying this price, but then every time a producer makes a sale, he has to go and pay a tax. So effectively, this is the actual price that they are receiving. And so this is called a price wedge, because there's a difference in the price. And this is exactly what microeconomics predicts as well. And now if we look at the surplus, you'll notice that it's exactly at 15, whereas before it was quite a bit over 15. So we see that the government actually came in and created a deadweight loss or a welfare loss or a surplus loss because due to the imposition of the tax. So now let's move on to other forms of government intervention. So the next form of government intervention we'll explore is the price floor. So this is a very interesting form of government intervention, at least I think so, because what actually happens is the government comes and they set a minimum price at which all transactions have to take place. So legally, even if a producer and a consumer are willing to make a trade below the price floor, they're just not allowed to. So for example, right now, if I just set the price floor at 0, at which practically no one is going to be able to make a trade, we should expect that the simulation should just run normally, right? We should just get the same market equilibrium again. And the same should be true for even as I increase the price floor a little bit, because most of the producers and consumers are making trades at this price. So it doesn't really affect them at much, 0.5, when the price floor is around 0.15 or 0.2. But as I slowly increase the price floor, you can see that suddenly all the producers and consumers start following the price floor. So now what happens is before only these consumers were stuck to their limit and they were not able to make trades. But now this extra set of consumers is not able to make are not able to make trades because the price is just too high for them. And on the other hand, all of these producers who wanted too high a price are now actually able to make a trade. And note that this actually only happens because the government actually comes and buys all the surplus. So any extra quantity that is produced by the producers and not bought by consumers, the government comes and interferes and buys it. So the government, due to the government's intervention, the demand curve actually shifts, right? Because now the government has also become one big consumer. But for now, let's only show the market consumers and ignore the government. Just know that they actually buy all of this extra quantity. So now we can see that there are very few consumers who are able to buy. So the consumer surplus goes down a lot. And on the other hand, there are a lot of producers who are able to sell. And that actually increases the producer surplus. But then again, the government also has to pay up money from their budget to provide to buy all this extra surplus. So that also net still creates a deadweight loss or welfare loss. So if we just stop it at a more static image, so last time when we saw it was like 15 was around here and the producer market surplus was around here. So we could say that it was around 17.5, 18, but now it's just a bit above 15. So you can see that there's still a market, there's still a welfare loss in the market due to the government intervention. So let's move on to the next form of government intervention, which is the price seal. And that's actually very similar to the price floor. So the price seal, as the name suggests, is the maximum price at which a transaction can occur. So price floor was the minimum price and price seal is the maximum price. So again, even if a consumer and producer are willing to make a trade at a price that's higher than the price seal, they're still not legally allowed to do it. So now, just like last time, if I just run the simulation normally with the price seal at around 1, meaning that pretty much all transactions can still happen because they'll all be less than 1. So we see that they all come back to the same old market equilibrium. But now if I slowly reduce the price seal, so far no effect, but if I slowly reduce the price seal, we see that again all the consumers have come to buy the product. It's because now all of these consumers who were originally not able to buy the product because their price was too low are now able to buy the product. But now all of these producers who were originally selling the product are now unable to sell the product. So they're stuck to their supply curve. And now you'll notice that there's actually a lot more fluctuation here, and it's not exactly on the line as compared to the other previous simulations, which were very well aligned to all the lines, the price floor, and the tax. And the reason is that there's actually a shortage in the market now. There are only this much of quantity is being produced by producers, but consumers end up wanting this much, meaning that consumers will actually accept a slightly lower price. Which means that some consumers are not able to make trades, so they try and increase their prices, and then suddenly they manage to get a trade because they're being randomly paired up with the producers, and so they come back down again. So this leads to a bit more instability. But net, if we just stop the simulation and see, we should still expect a welfare loss if we just keep running it. So again, we see that it's just over 15, whereas in the original market equilibrium, it was well over 15. So we see that there's still a welfare loss in the market. And so I think that's it for now. These are the basic forms of government intervention. And you can actually see how when we implement an ideal market, everything that microeconomics says, how there's going to be a welfare loss, how the consumer surplus and producer surplus is going to change, all that actually does happen in a real simulation. And most importantly, the principle of the invisible hand, which is that even when everyone acts in a self-interested way, they all reach a single equilibrium. And we see repeatedly again and again that, at least in our simulation, this is true. So I hope that gave you a better understanding of the demand and supply model and why the predictions, etc., actually work. So I actually made all of these simulations, which I just showed you, in the Julia programming language. And you can actually access the static and interactive version of both of these simulations. And I'll put the link in the description. However, the interactive version does take around 10 minutes to load, since it has to install a couple of big bulky libraries. But after that, it works really well, and it's actually worth waiting the 10-15 minutes.